they take motivational pictures and they make them real. So this is one of my favorites. It says, mistakes. It could be the purpose of your life is only to serve as a warning to others. And the next slide. Dysfunction. This was my personal favorite. The only consistent feature of all your dissatisfying relationships is you. Sad but true. Okay. I was born in Wisconsin. I was raised Lutheran. And on the surface, my family seemed pretty normal. But below that surface, there were years of suppressed anger. I don't remember much about my childhood, neither does my sister. But one thing we both have good memories of are the family parties that we had. Everybody on both sides of our family always flocked over to our house because we were fun, we hugged each other, they always felt better when they were around us. But it wasn't always like that. My mom had an explosive anger that made her very unpredictable. She wasn't always like this, but when she did get angry, I would often wish that she would hit me instead of listening to what she said when she was mad. I grew up believing what I was repeatedly told. I was stupid, I couldn't do anything right, and I was never going to amount to anything good. And my dad was a passive man who grew up having to control his anger and all of his emotions. He would hold on to everything until he couldn't take it anymore, and that final little straw would snap it, and everything he was holding on to would just explode out. So to protect us, he would normally hide downstairs in his workshop. Being from up north, we had basements. I had to explain that once to a group. They were scratching their heads going, who has basements in Texas? But he would often withdraw, and we didn't get a chance to spend a lot of time with him. And I learned at a very young age that giving any type of nonverbal or verbal response to either of my parents when they were angry usually only made it worse. So I learned to suppress my emotions. It was the only way that I knew how not to feel the pain that I did when they were mad. I joined the Air Force a year before I graduated from high school, but I left about a week after graduating and left for basic training, then on to Virginia and a short tour there, and then I went to the Philippines where I had my own personal prodigal son journey. With me finding myself in front of a Pentecostal church. And like I said earlier, I was raised Lutheran. So if you have never been to a Lutheran church or you've never been to a Pentecostal church, I got to tell you there's a little difference between the two religions. I had never heard of Pentecostals before I had been invited to that church, and I didn't know what I was getting into. It was unbelievable. The worship service was powerful, it was emotional, it was unlike anything I'd ever heard. And then the angriest man in the world stood up behind the pulpit and started screaming from Romans 1, sins of the flesh. Topic you don't hear much in Lutheran churches. I was terrified, and I couldn't understand why I was scared in church. And at the end of it, he had this thing called an altar call, which we don't have as Lutherans, so I had no idea again what was going on. I thought, good, we're going to pray, I'm going to get out of here, and I don't think I'm coming back. So he says, well, for those of you who heard the message and feel like you need to accept Christ into your life, raise your hand. Now, I'm not having any intention on raising my hand. The next thing I'm aware is my hand is in the air and I have to pull it down because it's not listening to my brain. And that was freaky. But what really scared me was when he said, okay, those of you who raised your hands, please come forward. And I have to tell myself to stand at attention because my legs are quaking, wanting to move. And I don't want to move. And then I hear this voice behind me say, just go up to the front. I said, who is... I turn around and there's like nobody there. Closed my eyes, the next thing I know, I'm halfway down the aisle going, when did I leave the pew? What's going on? You know, this isn't supposed to happen at church. When I got there, a man that I'd never met before asked me something that nobody in my life had ever asked me before. He said, what can I pray with you for? And it just knocked the wind out of me. I didn't know what to say. I said, I need help. That's the last thing I remember until a few minutes later, I'm coming back into my body, or I don't know what was going on. I just didn't feel any pain. I didn't know what happened. I didn't know what was going on. I just knew that something incredible had just happened, and I wanted to come back and experience that again. And the reason why I go into this detail at this part of my testimony is because if you're new to Celebrate Recovery and you've never experienced serenity, to you it's just a word. If you haven't experienced that peace that surpasses all human understanding. But if you keep coming back, you'll find it. because I found it in Celebrate Recovery, and so can you. When I did return back to the States after about 3 years of intense spiritual growth, I had a lot of biblical knowledge because Pentecostals, they like to study. But I lacked humility. And you can only get that through wisdom, which you can only get through experience. So within weeks of arriving at my first base in Fort Worth, I entered my first dysfunctional relationship. 22 years and 3 divorces later, I found myself taking a blue chip wondering what happened. I didn't know I was a codependent when I began coming to Celebrate Recovery. I'd never heard of the term. When I was in counseling after a divorce, my counselor referred to it as the knight in white shining syndrome, white armor syndrome. And even though I went to counseling on and off throughout the years, they never dealt with the issues that were leading to divorces. And it wasn't because they didn't want to, it was because I wasn't willing to open up to them and give them a chance to help me. We call it the insanity cycle. I've done a lot of reading on codependency since my first meeting, and if you're not reading about the addiction that brought you into these rooms, you need to. The more you know, the more you're going to grow. Codependency is a very difficult term to understand. I mean, where do you draw the line between healthy Christian serving and unhealthy Christian and unhealthy giving? So here are some of the major characteristics of codependency, and I'm going to go into some details as how they apply to me. Unrealistic forms of caretaking, denial, which Rob was telling me you guys just did the lesson on. Unhealthy dependency on others. There's poor communication skills, weak boundaries, lack of trust, a lot of anger. When I'm saying unhealthy caretaking, I would feel responsible for other people, for other people's feelings, their actions, their choices. If they were upset, it was because of something I did. If they were happy, if I wanted to get them happy, I had to do something to make them happy. They couldn't get happy on their own. I'd anticipate other people's needs and wonder why they wouldn't do the same. For me, I'd say yes when I meant no. I'd do things that I really didn't want to be doing. I'd do more than my fair share. I do things that they were capable of doing, but I do it before they'd even think about doing it. I'd often feel guilty about spending money on myself or doing things that were unnecessary or fun, because I wasn't used to doing things for myself. In my denial, I ignored problems or pretended they weren't happening or that they weren't as bad as they really were. I'd stay busy, so I didn't have to think about the things that other person was doing. I was a workaholic for most of my life. And if you've known anybody in the military, they kind of look for that, and they encourage it. So it was difficult to break from that. Emotionally, I rarely was happy, content, or peaceful. I always looked for happiness outside myself. And if I found somebody that I thought would give that to me, I'd latch onto them. I'd lose myself in that relationship because all I was focused on was making her happy. I'd seek love from people who weren't capable of loving healthy. I'd lose interest in my own life, my goals. I'd forget about them. Even though I would often feel trapped in that relationship, I stayed in them because I didn't want to be alone. And for communications, I didn't know how to talk about my emotions until I began to work with a counselor after my first divorce. At that time in my life, when I was in my 20s, the only way that I could communicate definitely was not through speaking. I'd have to write. And in my writing, I'd have to write in the third person, describing how Curt's talking to some imaginary person in his head so he can work out this problem that he's got with this relationship, because I could not communicate to that person directly. But there was another part of me that could. Boundaries keep us from being hurt. I didn't know how to do that, so I'd often let people hurt me, and I let them continue to do it. I wasted hours, weeks, sometimes even years trying to convince the person who was hurting me, hey, what you're doing's wrong. Why don't you stop? Well, why don't you stop, Curt? You know, it took me a while to realize that. Codependents don't trust people. They don't trust themselves. They don't trust their feelings. They don't trust other people. They don't trust God. And with lack of trust, you get anger. And often we repress it. And then when we let it go, I was doing just like my dad and my mom. So 1 Corinthians 13:12 says, "For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known." I didn't know then why I was drawn to women who were always in some form of crisis. I didn't know why I was always attracted to people who would take things from me and give nothing in return. I didn't know that when I was focusing on their issues alone, that I was doing it because I believed the lies I had heard growing up from my parents when they were angry at me. I didn't know that I actually hated myself. And even during the moments where I could see what I was doing clearly, and I knew the reality that I was in, I didn't know why I couldn't stop myself. I didn't know why I couldn't leave that relationship. The only thing that I did know is I would rather be in that painful, dysfunctional relationship than to be alone. So step 1 says we admit we are powerless over the past, and as a result, our lives have become unmanageable. CR has taught me how to apply what years of reading self-help books and hours in counseling couldn't. A good counselor would tell me when I was in counseling that the first 5 years of your life, they're going to have the greatest impact on who you're going to become as an adult. But it wasn't until I completed my first 12 step that all the dots were connected. Until then, it was just head knowledge. Now, I grew up in a very emotionally chaotic and abusive environment. Yelling and screaming were my norm. It was the only reality that I knew as a kid. So at a very young age, I learned that what I did could reduce that roller coaster. If I did what my mom asked me to, she wouldn't yell. If I did something funny or made her laugh, she'd be happy with me. I also learned that when she was angry, that I had to repress my emotions and not let her see what she was doing to me. And it was also a factor behind all of my divorces. Second thing I realized when I was doing my inventory, that the women I was drawn to were modeled after my first love, my mom. Now, good or bad, those early memories of her were burned into my subconscious. My mom had her own life issues when she was growing up, and they caused her to do and say the things that she did. And when I first gave my testimony right after my first 12 step, and I got to this point in my testimony, I'm yelling into the microphone because I'm still in pain about what my mom said to me. I don't yell anymore now because I realized through another couple of 12-step studies, and I keep coming back, just what I said, she had her own life issues. It wasn't personal in the sense that I didn't cause that. And it took me a while to understand that and to let go of it. Rob and I were talking about the cross, nailing things up to the cross before we met. I did that at the summit. That's how I was able to let go of the pain that I had toward my mom and begin to see her for a damaged woman. So for those of you who did that, I'm glad you all did. But my mom never sought help. She didn't believe in going to counselors. She didn't believe in talking to people about what happened in the past because it was in the past. What can you do about it? You can't change it. But working my inventory helped me see that no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't rescue her. I couldn't take away the pain that she had. She was the parent I looked for in all my relationships because she was the first woman I loved. And that's why I was subconsciously drawn to women who were broken. I couldn't fix my mom, but I always thought, maybe I can fix her. I'll feel good about myself like I did when I was younger. The 8th principle says, yield myself to God to be used this good news, bring this good news to others, both by my example and by my words. I often struggle with saying I'm grateful. You hear it a lot when you're in recovery meetings, and it's not easy for me. It's getting easier, but my point is, I'm not really grateful to God for what He's done in my life through recovery. And I always shock people when I say that, but there's a reasoning behind it. I am grateful to God for what He did on the cross, and I'm grateful for the salvation and the mercy and the grace and all the gifts that I now am able to accept because I've learned how to accept them through these meetings. But I have been going to church for decades, all during the divorces. Nothing stopped me from going through a divorce. The church didn't stop. God didn't stop. I needed to see somebody actually change their life. And I wasn't seeing that in church. So I asked myself when I'm writing these testimonies, what would my life be like today if it were not for the men and women before me who gave of themselves, their time, and that were leaders and sponsors and accountability partners and the people who served in other groups before me. I wouldn't be up on stage right now talking with you guys. I wouldn't be healed. I wouldn't be experiencing serenity. I've been in serenity now for years, a couple of years now. I have little things that pop up that kind of challenge me, and it's God's way of saying, you need to get this out, you need to deal with it. But I'm not in chaos anymore. And after decades of chaos, to say that you're not in chaos for 2 or 3 years straight, that's unbelievable. I would have never expected that. So this works. My point is, I'm the result of the time that these people invested in me. If my sponsor hadn't invested hours every month, meeting with me on the weekends, teaching me how to talk and make a friend and be transparent with another individual, I wouldn't be able to get up in front of people and share my testimony. Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 11:1, "Follow my example as I followed the example of Christ." There is no higher calling than that. We're here to help. So how am I different than when I first began my journey in Celebrate Recovery? Well, coming from a perfectionist family where conditional love was the norm, it was not easy to learn how to accept unconditional love. That was the first thing I learned through my first 12 steps. It didn't matter to God what I did in my past. It didn't matter to him that I made these mistakes. His love for me wasn't going to be any stronger or less if I had done anything different. And that took a little bit of time for me to get into my head. I have healthy boundaries in my life. I have healthy relationships. If there's something in my life, an individual in my life that is unhealthy, that they're stressful, or they are new to recovery, I don't rush to rescue them like a fireman like I used to. I let God take care of it. I'm not as impulsive as I was before I started coming to Celebrate Recovery. I've learned to wait. I can reset my internal needs clock in months versus, okay, God, you got 30 seconds, go. You know, I need to get out of this job. What are you going to do? 6 months later, I finally get out of the job. You know, whatever the issue is, it takes time. But in the process of waiting, I've learned to let go of things. And I like who I am now. And I couldn't say that when I was younger, so I like to say it again. I like who I am now. You know, when I'm using comedy, it's a healthy form of comedy. It's not a comedy that's keeping people at a distance so that way they don't get to know me. Jesus wrote in Luke wrote for Jesus, 6:38, "Given it will be given to you, a good measure, pressed down, shaken together, poured into your lap. For the measure you use will be measured to you." Now, during the first couple of years of my recovery, I wasn't really actively leading, but I always found a way to serve. And one of the first things that I noticed when I was talking with Rob and some of the other men is, "How many years have you guys been around?" And he's like, "We just celebrated our 1-year anniversary." And I was like, if you've never been to another Celebrate Recovery group, let me see your hands. If this is the only group that you've ever been to. Okay, you guys have got something incredibly special here. Okay, I have gone to dozens of different groups. And first of all, thank you for giving me the opportunity to share. I've done it with dozens of other groups, and you guys have something special. You do. This is cool. So, one of the frequent things people ask me in my group, I'm from Flower Mound, Lamb of God. So people walk up, they're like, "Well, I want to help, but what do I do?" So I always tell them, if you've got experience in the real world, physical world, you know, at a job, doing something that needs to be done here, you do it. If it's computers, if it's marketing, if it's whatever, there's a use for it here. And if you don't have the actual experience, but you've got the desire, get involved and learn, because everybody always starts out at the same point. They don't know anything about what they're doing until they do it. And when you get involved and you do things, you leave your comfort zone. And when you leave your comfort zone, you grow, because you're focusing on something else in your life other than yourself. And that was a critical turning point for me in my life. When I first came in here, all I could talk about was my ex-wife did this to me, this ex-wife did that to me. Got to the point where I was confused. You know, how do you explain to somebody, okay, this ex is doing this ex is doing that, and they're like, "Well, how many exes do you have?" "Okay, here's my baseball card, hold on to it." You know, I refer to it when I get confused. But the point is, I was a victim. That's all I could see myself as for years. And finally, it just clicked. It was in a testimony, and somebody said something, and I was like, "Oh my gosh, I'm doing that. I'm saying those words. Why am I saying those words? I'm speaking death into my life." And I stopped, and I got involved more. I began to serve more, began going outside my group, and it had a radical impact on how I viewed myself. Let's go ahead and get that last slide up. So earlier, we had the mistakes, my personal life verse from despair.com. Let's just take out the word mistakes, and I want to ask you guys, What does God say about your past? So I think Paul nailed it with this one. Romans 8:28. Many of you already know it, but I'm going to go ahead and say it anyways. In all things, not some, all things, God works for the good of those who love him. The things that were in my past that I thought were to shame, God's using for his glory now because I get to share my story. I've overcome things because I used my testimony in the past as a sword to attack the very things that I was afraid of in front of a group of 50 strangers. You know, I grew up stuttering, so public speaking is not something I would normally do, but we can do all things through Christ who strengthens us. And when you realize your life is always going to be a ship sticking out of the water, the question is, how are you going to use that ship? God can use you to bring incredible change in somebody else's life that's not in this room. But they're not going to know about what's going on here unless they see it in you. So keep coming back. Your lives are going to change, and you're going to have an impact and a legacy that one day you're going to be looking back and saying, I can't believe this happened. Thanks for your time, guys.